Have you ever wondered what happens to the person a frightened community decides to blame? There are names in our past that survive only as warnings. Old women at the edge of a settlement, blamed for the failed crop and the sick child and the calf born wrong. Until one day the blame becomes a torch and a rope and a thing the community agrees afterward never to speak of. We think we know those stories. We think we know how they end. But in a hollow in southeastern Kentucky, in the autumn of 1911, that story ended in a way no one expected. The people went up the mountain to deal with the woman they called a witch. And it was the people who did not come back. This is one of the most disturbing cases ever to come out of the Kentucky mountains, and it is disturbing for a reason that has nothing to do with witchcraft and everything to do with what fear makes people willing to do. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. Take a moment and know where you are, and that you are among people who wish you well, because the woman in this story was alone, and her neighbors decided her aloneness was a crime, and that decision cost more lives than anyone is comfortable counting. This is the case of Delphia Stroud. To understand how it happened, you have to understand how small and how frightened that world was. The hollow was in Leslie County, Kentucky, deep in the part of the mountains where the ridges run close and the sun reaches the valley floor for only a few hours a day. In 1911, there were perhaps 15 families scattered up the creek, subsistence farmers living the way their grandparents had, hours from the nearest town, with no doctor and no resident law and no defense against a bad year but prayer and one another. They were a tight, intermarried, deeply superstitious people, and in a place that poor, a single failed harvest or a single sickness in the livestock was not an inconvenience. It was the difference between living through the winter and not. When things went wrong in that hollow, people did not look for causes in the soil or the weather. They looked for someone to blame. And at the head of the hollow, alone, lived Delphia Stroud. Delphia was perhaps 35 in 1911, though no one was sure, and the uncertainty was part of the problem. She did not seem to age the way other women did. She had come to the hollow as a young bride and had lost her husband and both her children to a fever within a single year, and after that she had not remarried, had not moved down among the families, had simply stayed on alone in the cabin at the top of the creek. She kept goats. She grew herbs. She knew the old remedies, the granny cures, and for years the same neighbors who feared her had climbed up to her door when their own children took sick, because she knew things the rest of them did not. She was tall and lean and weathered, with long hands stained green at the fingers from her plants, and dark eyes set deep, and a habit of silence that the hollow read as judgment. She did not go to church. She did not need anyone. In that place, in that time, a woman who did not need anyone was the most frightening thing there was. For years it sat at a simmer, and nothing came of it. Then came the bad year. The trouble started, as it always does, small. In the spring of 1911, a child in the hollow took sick and died, which was common enough. But the child's mother had quarreled with Delphia Stroud the week before, over a goat that had gotten into a garden, and in her grief the woman began to say that Delphia had ill-wished the child. It was the kind of thing said in grief and usually forgotten. But that summer the corn came up blighted up and down the creek, and a milk cow died, and another child sickened, and the hollow, already hungry and already afraid of the winter to come, began to gather the small misfortunes into a single shape. The shape had a name. They had been afraid of the name for years, and now fear had a use for it. The first sign that the matter had turned dangerous came from the only man in the hollow who tried to stop it. His name was Reverend Asbury Combs, a lay preacher who rode a wide circuit through that country. And he is the source of much of what we know, because he wrote it down in a long account he sent to the county seat that autumn, an account that survives in a church archive in Haydn. Combs wrote that he had come up the hollow in August to find the families in a state he could only call a fever of their own. They had held meetings. They had talked themselves, night by night, out of grief and into certainty. They had begun to keep a list of every wrong thing that had happened in the hollow for 2 years, and to lay each one at Delphia Stroud's door. Combs preached against it. He told them that blaming a lonely woman for the weather was not faith but fear wearing faith's clothes. They listened politely, he wrote, and then they went back to their list. He left the hollow badly frightened, not of Delphia Stroud, but of her neighbors. Nobody outside the hollow thought much of it at first. Witch talk was old and common in those mountains, the kind of thing the valley folk smiled at. A poor hollow blaming its troubles on a strange woman was hardly news. The county had no reason to climb a bad road over a quarrel about goats and corn. The hollow had always settled its own affairs. It was left to settle this one. But here is the thing the county did not understand. The hollow had stopped talking about driving Delphia Stroud out. It had begun talking about something else. What happened in the 3rd week of October 1911 comes to us in fragments, because so few of the people who were there survived to tell it, and the ones who did would never agree on what they had seen. What is certain is this. On a cold night near the end of October, a party of men from the hollow, the account names 11 of them, the husbands and fathers of the dead children and the failed farms, went up the creek to Delphia Stroud's cabin at the head of the hollow. They went, by every account, to do her harm. Some accounts say they meant to drive her out. Others say they had passed beyond that. They carried torches and at least one rope. They were certain, after a summer of talking themselves into it, that they were going to lift a curse off their families by removing the woman who had laid it. 11 men went up the creek that night. The account is very clear about the number, because of what the number became. The Reverend Combs, who was not there but who gathered the names afterward from the widows, set each of them down in his account, who they were, whose father, whose husband, which dead child or failed field had finally driven each one up that creek with a torch in his hand. He wrote that he had begged 2 of them, by name, not to go. He wrote that they had told him a man could not sit in his own cabin and watch his family starve under a curse and do nothing, and that he, a preacher with no children buried that year, could not understand. Combs wrote that he had no answer for them, and that their faces in the firelight were not the faces of evil men, but of desperate ones, and that this was the part he could never afterward make peace with. Of the 11, 3 came back down before dawn. They came down, the Reverend Combs wrote, out of their minds with terror, unable to give a single account that matched another's. One of them never spoke sensibly again. The other 2 told stories that the hollow could not reconcile and would not repeat to outsiders. They said the cabin had been dark and the woman waiting. They said the torches had gone out, all of them, at once, though there was no wind. They said that something had come down out of the timber above the cabin, or up out of the ground beneath it, and that the men around them had simply not been there anymore, and that they 3 had run and not looked back, and did not know, could not say, would not say, what had become of the other 8. 8 men did not come back down the creek, and neither, after that night, did Delphia Stroud. When word finally reached the county seat, a deputy was sent up. His name was Harmon Eldridge, and he was a flat, unimaginative, deeply skeptical man who did not believe a word of the witch talk, and expected to find an ordinary, ugly crime. A mob that had killed a woman and then concocted a ghost story to cover a murder among themselves. He had seen it before. Fear made people violent, and violence made people lie. He went up the creek in November expecting to dig up Delphia Stroud and probably a man or two besides, and to hang whoever had done it. What he found did not let him keep that explanation. The cabin at the head of the hollow stood empty and undisturbed. There was no sign of violence in it, no blood, no struggle, no body. Delphia Stroud's things were all in their places, her herbs hanging to dry, her bed made, her goats still penned and bawling to be milked, days unfed. It did not look like the home of a woman who had been dragged out and killed. It looked like the home of a woman who had simply stepped outside and not come back. And in the soft ground between the cabin and the timber, Eldridge found the tracks of the men who had come up that night, 11 sets of boots coming up the creek toward the cabin. He could follow them in the cold mud. They came up to within a stone's throw of the cabin, into the open ground before the door. And there, in a rough half-circle, they stopped. 3 sets of tracks turned and ran back down the creek, the strides long and panicked. The other 8 sets of tracks did not turn. They did not go on to the cabin. They did not scatter into the woods. They came up to that line in the open ground, and they ended. 8 men's tracks, Eldridge wrote in his report, simply stopped in open mud, with no mark of struggle, no drag, no sign of where the men had gone, as though all 8 had been lifted straight up off the ground in the same moment in the dark before they ever reached the door. He did not write the rest of it in his official report. He wrote the rest of it in a letter to his brother, which is how we know it, and the letter has the cramped, careful hand of a man trying very hard to sound reasonable. He wrote that he had stood in that half-circle of ended tracks in the daylight, a grown armed man who believed in nothing, and had felt the hair stand up all along his arms. He wrote that the goats would not stop screaming. He wrote that there was a smell in the open ground before the cabin that did not belong to any season, cold and wet and mineral, the smell of deep stone, though the nearest cave was miles away. And he wrote that he had looked up, once, at the dark wall of timber above the cabin, and had felt, with a certainty that shamed him, that something up there was looking back, and was patient, and was not finished. He gathered his evidence, and he went down the mountain, and he did not go back up. The 8 men were never found, not that winter, not the next spring, not ever. There were no bodies, no bones, no graves. Delphia Stroud was never found either. The 3 men who came back down lived out their lives in the hollow, and the one who had lost his mind was cared for by his family until he died, and the other 2 carried whatever they had seen to their own graves, without ever putting it into words a neighbor could repeat. The county recorded the matter, finally, as 8 men lost on the mountain, cause undetermined, and a woman, Delphia Stroud, missing and presumed dead. It was the easiest thing to write. It was the only thing that fit on the line. Today, the hollow is empty. The families moved out, a few at a time, over the years that followed, and by the 1940s no one lived up that creek at all. The land is timber company ground now, and second growth, and the cabin at the head of the creek is a square of foundation stones in the brush that you would have to know was there to find. The loggers worked the lower hollow but left the head of it standing, and the company maps, for reasons no one in the office can explain anymore, mark that uppermost stand as not for harvest. Hunters go up the creek. They do not go all the way to the top. They say the goats can still be heard up there sometimes, on cold nights near the end of October, bawling to be milked, though there have been no goats on that mountain for 100 years. In the 1970s, a woman writing a history of Leslie County went up to photograph the old Stroud Foundation. She found the square of stones, and in the brush, half buried, she found a thing she could not explain, and that she described carefully in her book. She found a row of small flat creek stones set upright in the ground, in a line near where the cabin door had been, weathered and lichened with age. There were 8 of them. They were set the way you set markers at the head of graves, but there are no graves beneath them. The woman wrote that she had a county surveyor check, years later, with ground-sounding equipment, because she could not stop thinking about it. The ground beneath the 8 stones is undisturbed. Nothing was ever buried there. Someone, or something, set up 8 markers over 8 men who were never put in the earth at all. So what happened at the head of that hollow? There are 2 ways people have held this story, and a century has not chosen between them. The first is the one Deputy Eldridge went up the mountain believing that there was no witch and no curse at all. That 11 frightened, hungry, grieving men went up a creek in the dark to murder a woman, and that something went wrong among them in the confusion and the torchlight, and that the 8 who did not come down died at one another's hands or in the gorges in the dark, and that the 3 survivors built a ghost out of their own guilt, because the truth, that they had gone up to kill an innocent woman and gotten their own neighbors killed for nothing, was more than they could carry. In that telling, Delphia Stroud was exactly what the Reverend Combs said she was. Not a witch, a scapegoat, a lonely woman blamed for the weather, and the only true horror is what her neighbors were willing to do to her. The second telling is the one the hollow itself believed, and the one the ended tracks and the 8 empty graves seemed to insist on, that the hollow had been right to be afraid, but wrong about why. That Delphia Stroud was not the cause of their misfortunes, but the one thing standing between the hollow and something far older that lived above her cabin in the deep timber. That the strange woman alone at the head of the creek had been, for years, a kind of door, or a kind of guard at a door, and that the night 11 men came up with torches and a rope to destroy her. They tore down the only thing that had been keeping that door shut. In that telling, Delphia Stroud did not curse them. She was the last thing protecting them. And they killed her, and the mountain took the rest. This is one of the most unfathomable cases the Kentucky mountains have ever given up. And the thing that should frighten us most is not the witch and not the woods. It is how easily a frightened community talked itself into climbing that creek at all. So tell me in the comments, was Delphia Stroud an innocent woman murdered by her own neighbors? Or was she the only thing keeping the hollow safe, the door they were fools enough to break down? Drop your answer below, and tell me which of those frightens you more. If this story stayed with you, and you want to walk further into the histories these mountains buried on purpose, subscribe and ring the bell. We have more of these. They are not easy ones, but they are the ones the hollows agreed never to speak of, and someone should. The mountains keep their accused, and at the head of one Kentucky hollow, 8 men lie under stones that cover nothing at all.